presumably you don't have any questions about what we've gone over, and questions you do have about your assignments we can go over after the fact. And today, because we are treating perspective effectively as a tool from this point forward to do stuff with, rather than an end in itself, we need to introduce some different terminology as we start to combine perspective as just one tool amongst many as a way of dealing with composition. And as I think I remember, or as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, up until about 200 or so years ago, composition and perspective were effectively the same thing. Whereas perspective was an organizational system for how to put stuff together inside space, and was essentially perfected by the Italians in the 15th and 16th centuries. And once the, shall we call it the power center of the art world, moved gradually up towards France in the 17th or in the 18th and the 19th centuries, the cultural sphere of influence also started to move along with it. And in order to separate themselves, I guess, historically, ideologically, artistically, from the Italians, the French came up with their own theoretical system in terms of how to develop art. And foremost amongst those things was the introduction of this idea of composing images, which is essentially the same sort of thing that as perspective is doing, is arranging things in space, but now arranging things in space that wasn't required to use an illusionistic system of depth in order to create that particular thing. So the stuff that we're going to be going over from this point forward is very much French in origin, but very much interwoven with Italian stuff as well. This is just some interesting background information in case this stuff does actually interest you. Inside composition, two terms that you're likely to hear all the time: figure and ground. And for those of you who go into something that is more akin to the fine art side of things, right, these are really common terminology. Now, a bunch of different ways of talking about these things so that we're not confused, and also how they're specifically going to be used with respect to this class. One way of talking about figure and ground is just one thing in front of another. So foreground in front of background, or foreground in front of midground. So for instance, my hand on the page, my hand is figure, right? The page in behind it is ground. Right? Same, or likewise, the text on the page can be figure, the page itself is ground. If we're referring to me, right? So, or if we're referring to me, and then all the shit behind me, I'm figure, the shit behind me is ground. Right? But if I move here, this can be figure now, and then I'm ground in behind it. So it's just an oscillation, or an oscillation of things in space, one thing behind another with a potentially infinite regress. This will become more important for us again in the second half of the course. And some of you, I saw by virtue of your assignments that you're already experimenting with this kind of stuff, where you're putting those objects that are really close to the front of the picture, and then having successively, or objects that look successively further and further away from the front of the picture. So this is a very effective way of creating depth, but this is really just a fancy way of saying overlapping stuff in a really general term as a way of creating depth. Now, while this helps to create a sense of depth, just like perspective does, right? So those are two different ways of creating a sense of depth. Right? These don't necessarily have anything to do with composition. They have very much to do with how specifically, or how easy it is to read compositions, how clear they become visually, which we'll go over in the next couple of classes. But they're not really in and of themselves compositional techniques. They're more tools in the same way that perspective is. So as it relates to a compositional subject, what we can synonymously refer to figure as is, for our purposes, what's called a focal point. Right? And a focal point is exactly what it sounds like. It's something that you focus on in relationship to a picture. Basically, this thing is the most important thing inside the picture. And so it, in effect, is what the picture is about. It's the subject of a picture. Whereas your ground for our purposes, is the environment. Right? So basically everything that isn't the focal point is the environment. And there's this interrelationship between these two things. All we've effectively been doing up until this point is designing environments. And there's a good reason for it. It gives us a lot of time to deal with this stuff, but it also kind of emphasizes the importance of the environment in terms of sending a particular message about what picture you're looking at. Because even though the focal point is by definition the most important part of a picture, what you interpret the focal point as being, or how you interpret the focal point in an emotional sense, what the picture is about, so to speak, in terms of the message that it's trying to send, that has very much to do with how the environment forces you to interpret that focal point in a particular way. So whether or not you have a focal point in an up shot or a down shot or an eye level shot or an oblique view or a parallel view, all of those different kinds of environments are going to force you to interpret the focal point differently. Okay, so the focal point, for the most part, is a very small portion of your picture. And the importance of it is just that when you look at a picture, and today we'll start to be unraveling how we do this. When you look at a picture, it should be immediately identifiable, if the purpose of that picture is to identify a focal point, what that focal point is. Right, so that it's not unclear to your audience what they're supposed to be paying attention to. But by the same token, you're designing your environment in such a way that you feel a particular way about that focal point because of that interrelationship between each other. So we're not really thinking about these things as excluding the other. We're always thinking about these things synonymously or symbiotically with each other. And in an even wider sense, what we can interpret these things as is as the subject of a picture versus the content of a picture. So really widely construed, we can think about this as being, all right, well, what's the physical stuff inside the picture? You know, where are things happening? Who are we looking at? And what does it look like? All of that stuff. And then here, this is very much the why. You know, why do I give a shit? Why has it been arranged in a particular way? How do I feel about all of the stuff that I'm looking at? Okay, so how we design these things as they relate to these things, right, identifies this stuff, but how we design this stuff and this stuff, or sorry, how we design this stuff also helps us to identify where it is we're supposed to be looking. So today we're developing kind of an interrelationship between these things and taking the first step of applying the tools that we've got at our disposal to develop both of these things, right? The subject of a picture, the focal point, and the content of that environment and what it feels like. Now, we've already done a lot of this stuff, and I've specifically structured the course this way where as we go forward, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be introducing more specifically will already have done in one way or another, and I'm basically just going to be kind of deepening that conversation at a particular point. So for instance, one way to create a focal point, or two really effective ways of creating a focal point. One is central positioning in relationship to the frame. So for reasons that we'll go over in the second term, the center of the frame is a really important part of the frame. We naturally attribute more importance to the center of the frame on a deep-seated psychological basis. And basically, when we put anything in the middle of the frame, it automatically adopts the importance that is already associated to the middle of the frame. Okay, so whenever you put something in the middle of the frame, this is something to be aware of. It's basically like saying that that object, whatever you put there, character, object, animate or otherwise, is important, right? All caps type of thing. Another way of developing focus is by using what's called directional focus. And most specifically, by using your 1-point vanishing point. So when you put a horizon line in a particular spot, refresh my memory, justify my existence of the universe, or in the universe. Where is the 1-point vanishing point on a hypothetical viewer's face?
Middle of the eyes.
in the middle of their eyes, right? So when we position the horizon line, we're not only positioning the audience vertically, right? Where are they looking at something from? But we're also taking that vanishing point or the center of vision and placing your audience laterally, so that wherever this thing is in theory exactly where your audience is sitting and where they're imagining that they're viewing that picture from. It's like, again, having the perfect seat in the theater all the time, so to speak. Okay, so as you move these things around, you're physically moving your audience around, down here, up over here, directly in the middle of the frame, etc. Now, because this does this, right, or because this is the implication here, when you place the audience, wherever you place the audience, right, and when you place them in a particular spot, you can do what's called privileging the viewer. Edging, I think it's that. And you can privilege them to a greater or a lesser degree. So for instance, if I want to make the audience feel really important, like they've got that, again, perfect seat in the theater, I can put the horizon line directly in the middle of the picture. But if I put the vanishing point also directly in the middle of the picture, what that means is that these two things now coincide with each other, right? Where your audience is not only able to identify where they are, but they're able to identify themselves in the position that they unconsciously recognize as being the most important area of the picture. Now, what perspective lines do when I start to drop these things in is they essentially act as guides. They're called visual pathways. Don't be confused by the terminology if it's confusing at all. This is just stuff that you're likely to hear. Right? Visual pathways, perspective lines, directional rays, they're sometimes called. What you can think of those things as are as arrows or fingers that point towards what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. Right? Now, it doesn't matter if they're a finger or an arrow. It could be a stick, for example, that just lays on the ground, right, and points in a particular direction. It could also just be a tree branch or a lightning bolt that points in a particular direction. It could be the bottom of a building or the top of a building in perspective that's pointing towards a particular direction or a spot. Your brain is very good at recognizing patterns. And when it starts to see these things all kind of moving towards a particular point, your brain wants to complete the direction that it's going to. And when those things cross over each other, they create what's called a point of convergence. That point of convergence creates a sense of what's called visual tension. All visual tension creates focus, regardless of how it's created. Right? So basically, when you put your audience in the middle of the frame, when you put something in the middle of the frame, and then when you associate a one-point vanishing point with that middle of the frame, you have two different tools working to tell the audience what the focal point of the picture is, as long as that focal point coincides with that thing. Okay, so this is going to be part of your assignment today, is to include a focal point inside the center of the frame, but then also put that object or put that scene and that object so that they coincide with a vanishing point, a one-point vanishing point directly in the center of the frame. And what we're going to increasingly do as we move forward is essentially predefine how it is you're going to draw a particular picture, so that that particular picture is designed in such a way that that environment is constructed to predetermine a certain kind of content to it. So it automatically, regardless of what you populate the scene with, whether it's puppies, fishes, or hamburgers, right? It's like that thing is still going to feel the same way, right? Because of the design aspects of it. Okay, so that's going to be one part of what you're going to do, and you're already familiar with that, or you're already familiar with this stuff. So in terms of the ghost in the shell character on top of the rooftop, right? We've already pointed that out as all the buildings and all the signs point towards her on top of that rooftop. In terms of the baby Herman character inside the crib, exact same structure as that. In terms of Morpheus being on the roof or in the room after Neo kicks the shit out of it with a Gatling gun and he's sitting there, right, on that chair. Exact same structure as all of these things. So when you look at those pictures, you know immediately and without a doubt what the focal point of that picture is. And this is another kind of a consequence of this, because you know that you're standing directly opposite those characters, it's a very effective way of you now identifying an audience with that character, right? To help you, you know, sympathize with their position, develop an emotional response to that character, basically just give a shit, right, about that character, that thing, stuff, etc. Okay, so you're going to be doing both of these in your assignment. That's what we would call the structural aspect of a picture, right? How do you design a picture so that you're basically directing visual traffic towards a particular area and you can predict where people are going to look at things and in what order they're going to look at those things. But running concurrently with this is the emotional aspect of stuff, right? And these are the two hats that we're always wearing when we're creating pictures. What kind of structure do I want to choose to create a certain emotion? Or what kind of structure is most appropriate for it? Or what kind of emotion do I want? And as a result, what kind of structure is necessary in order to create that? So again, they have a symbiotic relationship with each other. This is the structural component of it. And if this is confusing at all in the abstract, this will become very clear when I start to do an example of your assignment. The other part, right? And this will be the part that we spend the rest of the time, right, talking about, because even though it's the emotional side, the application of perspective to developing that emotional side is a little bit, it takes a little bit of unpacking. Whereas this, I think, is pretty straight. This is pretty straightforward. Okay, so your only job in terms of the structural aspect of the picture for applying perspective is to make sure your focal point is directly over top of that vanishing point. Any questions about what I'm referring to here in terms of these two characteristics? Okay, well, I'm going to introduce some terminology then for the emotional side of things. This isn't a bad screen to screenshot. A little bit simpler and more straightforward than the usual mad scientist stuff that you got. Okay, on the emotional side of things then, and these are terms that I've just invented, right, as a way of communicating what it is that I think that they communicate. We have two large umbrella categories of emotional states: artificial and what I'm going to call natural. Now, when I say the word artificial to you guys, what comes up? What do you think of in terms of objects?
Man-made.
Man-made. Okay, great. As opposed to, say, shit that you pull out of the ground.
Yeah.
For instance.
My
Okay,
eraser.
so,
It's not an actual rainbow, but it's an artificial rainbow.
a what?
That's what came into my head. My eraser. It's shaped like a rainbow. It's not actually a rainbow.
Yeah, it's fair, because there's different ways of interpreting these terms, right? So we're going to be talking about them in a very particular way. One way of talking about artificial is fake, right? You're an artificial person, right? For example, right? You've got an artificial personality, so to speak, right? So what I mean when I'm saying artificial isn't that it's fake, but much more clear, or much more akin to the it's a man-made product, a person-made product, as opposed to, so we've got planes, trains, and automobiles, so to speak, versus, you know, bees, birds, and bushes, right, over here. Now, what's more important about that, right, is what would you say are design characteristics? Say that you had to describe those objects as being, why would they be distinct from these kinds of objects? And what kind of characteristics would these things have as opposed to these? Just give me some, for example.
Different sizing.
Okay, well, which would be different sizing? These or this?
Artificial.
Okay, so what do you mean by different sizing?
Like artificial versions can't create the exact same sizing as something you see in nature. If you make an artificial tree, it's not going to be the same.
Oh, okay, but so what you're doing there is you're comparing the two, right, to each other, right? So if I asked you this, right, let's just say take really basic shapes as an example, and say that I put those shapes next to each other versus these shapes to each other, and I asked you which one is artificial, right, or which one is natural. Which one is artificial or more artificial, and which one's more natural, one or two?
One's artificial, two's natural.
Okay, why?
Because one's all the same shape and two varies shapes.
Okay, so there's a key characteristic of the two. Repetition as being reflective of something that's artificial. Where did I get a charcoal stick from? I don't want to draw on charcoal. It's just going to become a mess. Repetition becoming reflective of an artificiality of design versus variety. Right? We tend to associate the variety of the natural world with things that, right, are not only reflective of the natural world, right, but also reflective of variegation in design principles, right? Something that wants to get across the emotional response that we have to the natural world, right, in the way that it's variegated. Right, so what this refers to, right, is variation of all different what are called perceptual categories. So size, shape, spacing, detail, design, and when we get into it, same thing with color, value, texture. Basically, the more that you have of this, the more artificial that picture is going to feel. The more that you have of this, the more natural that picture is going to feel. So if you had to choose, say, a perspective that we've already gone over, say 1 point or 2 point, parallel or oblique, which one's more artificial, which one's more natural?
1 point's more artificial.
Okay, again, same question, why?
Because there's less variation.
That's variation, for sure. Think about it this way. When I position myself in relationship to the camera like this, right, do I feel like I'm, right, trying to make a more visual impact on you or less visual impact? As opposed to positioning myself like this.
More.
When you have a conversation with your friend, say that you're just like hanging out, right, mindlessly chatting about the details of the day, right? Do you square up to your friend and talk to them like this, right? Or do you just kind of like hang out and you just kind of drift off into space and like, I wonder how they got that lovely chandelier up there, so you do shit like that, right? This is what I mean by artificial versus natural, right? In terms of 1 point versus 2 point. I agree with you that it's 1 point, but why it's artificial, right? Is it not necessarily because there's less variation, right? But because you've put that audience in that privileged position, right, where they're directly in front of that 1 point. The world does not arrange itself for us like this, right? The world is just booming, buzzing confusion, right? As a cranky German once said. Basically, it's like that 2 point becomes more reflective of the variety that we associate with the world because of that naturalized orientation to it. Whereas 1 point makes it feel like that picture, that thing, that person, that whatever is trying to make a point, trying to make an impression on you. Right. So for instance, like when we used to do this shit in person, every auditorium, every classroom that you've probably ever been in a pedagogical sense has every light and line of that place directed towards where that person who's teaching you stuff is standing. right? Because it's in the interest of them making the most immediate visual auditory impact on you in order for their presence to be highlighted as much as possible. And it's in your interest, obviously, as well, right? So you just don't fucking drift off into nothingness, drift off into the, you know, intellectual ether and wondering what you're going to do with the rest of your day when this voice eventually stops. Okay, so when we position something like this, it's basically, it's a didactic type of orientation. The picture is there to tell you something, there to teach you something, right? There to make sure that you don't miss something. So this becomes a very effective way, for instance, like introducing characters that are central to the idea of a picture. What is that character in Ghost in the Shell, right? Who is that character that we're supposed to be paying attention to? Who is that thing in that crib? What is that thing in the wet room, right? All of those things are essential to the story that you're watching. And as a result, if you miss it, right, you're going to have problems interpreting the story. So this is a very effective way of underlining it. But it also comes across with these types of interpretations. Now, the reason these are important is because these have emotional correlatives. So when we design a picture like this, we're essentially designing an emotion. So if you had a picture, if you had, sorry, there was a buzzing at the door. If you had a picture that was designed like this and you had to describe it emotionally, what would be a word that you would use to describe? And think about the picture as a person. This is always easier to do when you think about the picture as a person, because we're not used to thinking about pictures in emotional terms. But if you had to describe a character that had this kind of characteristic versus this kind of characteristic, what would be an emotional characteristic that this character might have?
Boring.
Okay, boring. What could be a potentially positive characteristic that that character might have? So presumably, if this character is boring, this character is exciting, yes?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. What's a potentially positive characteristic of this?
Organized.
Organized. All right, so what's the opposite of that?
Disorganized.
Just put the prefix in front of it, yeah. Disorganized, right? Another way of, a less nice way of saying that would be, say, chaotic. Okay, let's have some other ones over here. There's lots of them, so just spit them out.
Strict.
Okay. All right, and what about here then? What would be the opposite of strict? Not strict.
Easygoing.
Okay, easy going. Okay, so let's give a positive one.
Content.
Intent,
Content.
content. Maybe. Yeah, that'd be a tough one to kind of like lump into these particular binary oppositions. I know lots of people that would feel very discontent being organized, right, and very content. I think content would be like like almost a second order type of emotion as we're going through. The benefit of doing this, right, is just that you start thinking about what we're doing, right, in terms of creating pictures as having consequences in terms of how people interpret these pictures emotionally. So let's say I said logical. Is that artificial or natural?
Artificial.
Okay, right, because that organization of mind in order to be able to treat things in a logical type of manner.
I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me though. Variety can be logical as well.
It can be, right? But by the same token that, you know, we're essentially designing a picture, right? In the sense that we're trying to create what would be a good way of putting it? Something that doesn't look like it's organized. We're organizing a picture in a way to reflect that type of disorganization. In the way that we're talking about it here, a logicality of repetition, right? Certain things proceed from other things, that type of logical progression. Whereas if we deal with that in a natural progression or a natural type of way, right, we might be thinking about that, right, as the opposite of logical. right?
I
in
mean,
terms of
I get what you're saying, but there's also like, think about the population of animals in nature. Like, it's disorganized, but it's natural and there's a logic to it.
There is, right? And again, there's different ways of talking about each one of these terms.
Mm.
But think about it in terms of, say, a character. Let's say, take Spock from Star Trek, if you guys are familiar.
No.
No? All right, what's an updated version of Spock? Who is the,
The guy from Big Bang Theory.
Oh yeah.
Sheldon.
okay, that's unfortunately, I've never seen Big Bang Theory. This is the problem of having different visual vocabularies. Who do we got? Sorry?
Well, he basically is Spock. Like he like tries to be Spock.
Yeah, I think Spock's his favorite character is part of.
Okay, so, well, maybe randomness isn't the best way of putting it, right? Maybe a better way of distinguishing between the two is emotional,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, here you're privileging intellect, here you're privileging emotion.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah.
So now let's say that we consider this, right, a positive aspect of things. Is there a way to think about this as being negative? And let's say that just in contrast to this, like we're thinking about being emotional, like controlled by your emotions, so that, you know, when a stiff breeze blows by, you burst into tears for some reason. I'd say that that's the negative connotation of that. Is there a negative way of thinking about this, and is there a positive way of thinking about this?
Yeah, sometimes like when you think about like achieving a goal, like based on logic, you get disappointed because it's so hard and you don't want to do it. But if you're like very emotional person and like just give yourself some hope, like you can keep going and achieve it.
True. True. The direction that I was thinking about it with respect to that is like, rather than thinking about like the consequences of that emotion, or what that might imply about that person, on a second order of things, is more of like, okay, well, if you thought about a person who was extremely logical, what would you expect their emotional personality to be? Would you expect them to be a warm and friendly person, or a cold and distant person?
Cold and distant.
Okay. Right. So that's the potential negative side effect of that, right? Where they're cold, they're distant, they're repressed potentially, right? There's like, they're removed, they're not in touch with like a sympathetic, empathetic aspect in themselves. Whereas if this person was emotional, what's a potential positive of that?
Caring.
Caring, right? They're warm, they're fuzzy, right? There's the person that you want to spend time with, right? When you got problems, when you care about somebody listening to your problems. Now, the important part about this, right, is that neither one of these things are inherently positive or negative, right? Artificial or natural in terms of their organizational principles. So privileging repetition or privileging variety doesn't mean that these things are good or bad things. What these do, right, is create a certain kind of environment that you can arbitrarily attach to either good groups of people, bad groups of people, right? Hero, villain, good guy, bad guy, right, etc. Right? And this is the point of me asking you to watch the 300 example, right? And then the Force Awakens example. In the 300 example, the Spartans get attached to this, right? But in Lord of the Rings, right, the elves get attached to this. It's the same shit, right? But in 300, the Persians get attached to this, right? And the orcs and Mordor gets attached to it as well. You get complete organization, complete logic, right? Complete, right? I guess, what would you call it? Collaborative effort, a collective on this side, on the side of good. Here you get random disorganization, ultimate blinding freedom, so to speak, right? Ultimate individuality on this side of the spectrum. And as a result, what you know immediately is that those two groups of people aren't going to get along. It's a very effective visual way of separating groups from people, or from each other, right? And it's the exact same thing with the Incredibles. Right? You have Mr. Incredible being associated with this side, but now this side is good. That character can fly, jump, zip, and zoom everywhere. They're radically free, radically individual, if you want. The boss and the entire environment that that boss thrives in is this over here, right? Where it's perfectly organized, like when he moves the pencil back into position, right? All the clocks tell the same time, in the office, right? He's wearing a suit, right? That looks like it's still got the coat hanger, right? Stuffed inside of it. And it's the exact same thing with the Force Awakens. This is the Rebel Force, right? Everybody looks like they've just kind of like thrown whatever they've like found on the ground in terms of clothing, right? For a uniform. Whereas the Empire, everybody's dressed the same, moves the same, showed up to the same party, acting the same way. Okay, so these things, right, again, it's important to remember this, right, that these things don't have any sort of inherent aspect. And the most important aspect of this is what we're dealing with here is stereotypes. And I don't mean stereotypes in the pernicious way, right, in the sense that there's some sort of like primitive racism or bigotry that's going along, right, with this. I mean stereotypes in the way that we all think on an everyday basis. So as a really simple example of that, if I gave you the example of a person, say I gave you a person that's like had a collar buttoned up right to the top with a bow tie on, right, and a tweed jacket buttoned up, horn-rimmed glasses, horseshoe pattern balding, nice trim little mustache, shuffles into an auditorium carrying a briefcase, right, looked like he had a steel rod right up his back. Right. And then I asked you what that character was, what that person was in terms of their profession. And basically it was multiple choice. And I asked you if that is that character more likely to be A, a librarian, B, a farmer, C, a heavy equipment operator. Right. What's your answer?
Librarian.
Librarian. Statistically speaking, you'd be way more likely to be accurate to say heavy equipment operator. There's way more of them. Right. So you're not basing your answer on anything other than this. What does that character present themselves as that allows you to cut through a bunch of the shit that you would have to do otherwise in terms of asking that person questions about their lives, in terms of what they're most likely to be, right? And again, in the really extreme sense of this, right, this is where we start to venture into the realms of racial profiling, etc. It's not the way that we're talking about it. We're talking about using characteristics that we generally recognize as leaning us towards one of these things or another as a way of influencing our interpretation of a picture. So when you do your assignment, you're going to be doing your assignment entirely in one point as a way of reflecting this kind of environment. Because what we're trying to do is design an environment. But from this point forward, when you design environments, I'd like you to think about your environments as characters. A character that, like actual characters, people characters, are physically interacting with. And sometimes they get along with those environments, sometimes they don't get along with those environments. So in Mr. Incredible, at the beginning of those examples, is, you know, chasing bank robbers, right, and fucking saving kittens and pulling trees out of the ground, right? It's like, that's an environment that character feels at home in. But as soon as Mr. Incredible is stuffed into that tiny little car, and stuffed in that tiny little cubicle in that environment that feels like it's soul crushing because it's monochromatic gray with fluorescent lighting, you know that character is immediately uncomfortable and not at home. But his boss loves it there. His boss would be eaten by wolves in the other environment. Okay, so it's a very easy way of making characters feel comfortable or uncomfortable in their environment as well. So how you're going to use this, though, right, goes back to our second class in terms of using one point to create a sense of repetition. So as I mentioned, promised, threatened, one might say. You can screenshot this if you so desire. Earlier this class is that I've already kind of introduced this stuff, right? So when we were doing the circle lecture in the second class and talking about how to develop a square. When you do this in a perspective field in order to find the back edge of that square, and again, you can do it in either direction. When I do this again, I create another square. I do this, I create another square. I do this, I create another square. I do that, I create another square. Even though those squares look like they're different sizes, what I've got is a perfect repetition of those squares recessionally. And as I mentioned, we're very good perceptually in terms of recognizing patterns. And when we recognize a pattern like this, what we recognize is that there's a symmetry, a regularity, an artificiality to that type of recession, which is going to differ distinctly from, say, a or a recession like this, which is equally valid, right? But feels very different than that. If I was to say that, say this is a sidewalk, right, that has equal repetitions as it moves back between its separations. Say that you wanted to create a tiled floor, right, because you're interested in drawing or designing the interior of a Renaissance church. All of Renaissance architecture, again, is based on this. So there's a peculiar harmony to those types of things. Whereas if you were to compare this to, say, a Gothic cathedral is just a fucking mess compared to this. These guys were reacting in direct opposition to the mess that was the Gothic, because those Gothic cathedrals were built up over hundreds of years by varying architects, varying styles, etc. It's like there wasn't a regularity to them. And depending on how you view beauty, right, you're going to find one more or less beautiful, right, depending on whether or not you really like order or mayhem, so to speak. So if I duplicate that front square and then just stretch these lines out, now I've created an even bigger repetitive pattern. And if I do the same thing from this side, in whatever way I decide to do it, now I've made an even bigger pattern. And if I wanted a smaller pattern, I could subdivide that. So now I've got, even smaller squares inside of that square. And then I could do the exact same thing again. So now I've got even smaller squares inside of that square, and so on and so on and so on. And you can do the exact same thing on a vertical. So when we were doing this, with your second assignment. Okay, well, now I've got perfectly vertical squares. So if I want these things to be individual buildings, right, now I've got an equal recession of buildings. If I want to then, say, do this and subdivide this, now I've got a way of developing an equal recession of windows inside that space. Or find where a door is going to be in equal recession in each one of those buildings, so that this has that repetitive patterning as it disappears off into the distance. I can stretch this out. I can make this a long rectangle, and then make that another rectangle and another rectangle, etc. Right, but you can use that application of finding that square from the second class as a way of establishing a repetitive pattern. Now I'm going to apply this to an example that I'll do of what your assignment's going to look like. But I first off want to just refresh our collective memory about how to do this, because there's multiple ways of doing this that don't rely on the square. Does everybody remember this from the distant past of our educational experience?
Yeah.
Is anybody confused by this?
Nope.
Okay, well, alternative ways of doing this. Let's say that you don't want to do a square. Let's say the thing that you want is, for whatever reason, this shape. I want an equal repetition of that particular shape. Did I just fuck this up? Hold on, I got to do this vertically. It is kind of remarkable that, again, spatially, I have the job that I do, considering how bad I am at certain spatial things. Okay. just might not work the way that I've done it here. Okay. What you do, right, in terms of, say that this is the size of space that you want to duplicate along a vertical. So let's say that this is the front edge of a building and this is the back edge of a building. Or this is one light post, this is another light post. When you place this distance, this first distance is entirely arbitrary. Right, so you just get to decide where that goes. Now, in order to find the third one, what you're going to do is take the halfway point between the top and the bottom of the first one, and then connect that halfway point back to your central vanishing point. Where that crosses over the second one is going to be its midpoint, right? Just like it is on the first one. So in order to establish the third one, you're going to take a diagonal line through that midpoint and extend it until it bisects the top recessional line. And you can do the exact same thing in the other way. And those two things will line up on top of each other, and that gives you your third one. And then that space is equal to that space. And then you just keep doing the exact same thing. And it doesn't matter whether or not you do it from top to bottom, bottom to top. But that's another way of finding buildings that are equally spaced from each other, windows that are equally spaced from each other, fence posts, parking meters, lamp posts, anything that's vertical that has that regular spacing. Right, so how you would do that horizontally is find the halfway point laterally now, connect that back to your central vanishing point. That gives you a bisecting point there. And now take a diagonal from here to here until it crosses over there. It does not need to hook up with a 2-point because that's only in the case of you wanting to create a square. So as I do this, from this direction to that direction, those things will line up beside each other, and then it's just rinse and repeat. So now you get an equal recession of rectangles. That makes sense? This is the one that usually gets a bit hazy for people. So if it is hazy, by all means, say something about it. Okay, another way of doing this, which is very similar to this. Say that you know that you want multiple subdivisions inside of a space. Say that you know that you want this vertical space to be divided up, let's just call it in 4 different sections. So I'm going to divide those up into 4 equal sections. Connect each one of those points back to that central vanishing point. And then just like you've established this arbitrary distance here for the first one, establish an arbitrary distance again. So again, that's arbitrary. You can put it wherever you want. Okay, now in terms of finding, that now gives you, right, equal divisions. Now to find the next, take a diagonal line through this point, but now extend it. And where that crosses over here, and here, and here, that gives you the next divisions. And then you can just keep doing that. And again, I'm making allowances for my shitty drawings. Those will all be equidistant. And it's the exact same thing on a horizontal. So if I know that I want this space to be divided up into 4 equal sections, connect all those things back there, arbitrarily establish a first distance, drag this through, And then those are all equally recessive. Okay, so you're going to have to apply this to your assignment, right, as a way of inflecting that assignment with an artificial feeling. Why is this thing unplugged? Does this make sense to everyone? All right. Well, for your assignment, I'm going to ask you to do certain things. So I'm going to give you the assignment description, then I'm going to do an example of the assignment. You can screenshot this. An example of how to do this, I think, is in your second handout. So this is, it might be in this handout, but I'm pretty sure, I'm almost positive that I put it in the second handout instead. Okay, for your assignment, it's going to seem like I'm asking you to do 3 drawings, but really I'm asking you to do 1 drawing in 3 parts. First part of your assignment is to create an artificial environment. And let's just call that an artificial street scene. So as a way of emphasizing that artificiality, you're going to have as much repetition as possible. Right? Which means you're going to have certain characteristics. You're going to have your 1-point vanishing point directly in the center of the frame. Which means by default, your horizon line is also going to be in the center of the frame. It also means that you're going to have symmetry. The same thing that occurs on one side of the frame is going to be the exact same thing that happens on the other side of the frame. And in addition to this, I'd like you to leave an open space in the center of your frame. This will become more obvious what I mean by this in a moment. This is where you're going to ultimately put your focal point. That open space I'll be referring to in subsequent lectures as being essentially a focal area. It goes by a bunch of different names. Well, we'll get to that when we get to it. Okay, so these are the characteristics of drawing number 1. This, as is usual, has a frame around it. Drawing number 2 is that you're going to design a focal point. Whatever that is doesn't matter to me. Right? So you can have whatever it is that you want. But with the knowledge that in part number 3, you're going to be taking drawing number 2 and smashing it into the space that you've provided for it in drawing number 1. Right, so you're going to be, there's 3 different ways that you can do this. Right, the way that I would suggest doing it is that you draw this, scan both of them, pump them into Photoshop, and then cut and paste this thing into that thing. That's the easiest way to do it. More difficult way to do it, I don't know why you would do it this way, and you'd have to have access to a photocopier in order to do it, is that you draw this, photocopy, old school cut and paste, and then scan this back, the combined version back in. The other way of doing it, the masochistic way of doing it, is to draw this, redraw the whole thing. And I do not recommend doing that. Life is too short and there's other more interesting shit to do with it. Right, so the Photoshop version is the version that I highly recommend that you do. But regardless of which drawing or which way you do, I want to see this in 3 separate parts. Because essentially what you're doing here is you're designing the structure of this picture, and you're just to both create a space for a focal point, but also to feel a particular way. So that when you introduce the focal point into that focal area, the focal area and the design of the picture is already determined where it is you're going to be focusing when you show them that focal point. And when you see the combined version, you not only know what to look at, but you also know how to feel. right, as a result of the design of that thing. So again, it's one drawing in 3 parts, but you're thinking about it in 3 parts, so we start more and more thinking about drawing sequentially, right? As how one drawing affects another drawing, is affected by previous drawings, etc. So it's no different than upshot versus downshot in this regard. Upshots making downshots feel more like the other thing, right? This thing being designed in advance of the expectation that you're going to insert something into it. So the biggest part of this is that in order to make this work, the perspective of your object have to match. So if your focal point has perspective to it, its relationship to a horizon line has to be the same as the open space is relationship to a horizon line. This will make more sense momentarily. Okay, so let's say that this is your assignment. Now, for reasons that will become clear as we move into the second term, what I mean by putting this open space and the focal point in the center of the frame is along the vertical axis. So your horizon line has to be in the middle of the frame. We know that. Your center of vision also has to be in the middle of the frame because your 1-point vanishing point has to be in the middle of the frame. Now, in an ideal situation, we have an open space that exists here, and this is where your focal point is going to go, because that makes the effect as obvious as possible. But for purposes of this assignment, you can put your focal point anywhere along this vertical axis. It does essentially the same thing, but to a lower degree. Okay, so if you have your focal point anywhere along that vertical axis, it's going to make sense. Now, in terms of repetition, if I was to draw a sidewalk over here and then just arbitrarily said that, okay, that sidewalk is going to end there. And that there's going to be a building that starts there. If I put my first sidewalk division here, what I want to see in your assignment is that there's an effort to do one of the ways that we've gone over in terms of breaking this space down so that it's in a repetitive pattern. And then likewise along the vertical. Now, a cheat in terms of doing the vertical would just be to use these divisions. So if there's 2 sidewalk divisions here, then there's 2 sidewalk divisions in the next one, and 2 sidewalk divisions in the next one. If I want to put a row of windows here, I can use any tool at my disposal in terms of making a bank of 3 windows, or I might have a window here that's got a nice central division, and then a space, and then another window there that has a central division. Right? And same thing for parking meters. All of those are going to have an equality to them. Etc. Now, whatever you put over here has to show up over here. So that means if I put a chimney that looks like that there, that same chimney shows up over here. That means if I put a cloud in the sky, that same cloud, as ridiculous as it may seem to you, shows up over here. If I put a manhole cover here, that same manhole cover shows up over here. Now, some clever student in the past figured out that if they just drew half of the drawing and then duplicated it in Photoshop and then glued it together by flipping it, that would cut the work in half for them. And I'm totally okay if you do that. Right. This is not a make work type of situation. This is, if you can figure out a way to do this assignment more quickly and more effectively that it will save you time, fucking power to you. Good on you. Right? So the important thing to me is that you understand the concept, right, of it. And doing half of a drawing in terms of increasing the mechanical ability of it, as far as I'm concerned, is just as good as doing the same thing, right, on the other side. Okay, so that means that this spacing here needs to be exactly the same. The height of this building needs to be exactly the same. If you've done this side, the other side becomes just as easy. They're easy to draw because essentially you can just drag all these lines over. And duplicate things. Okay, so again, I am going to be particular about this because the whole idea behind doing this is that it's creating a certain kind of effect. And the idea behind, oh, look at that, that's nice. Happy. The whole idea behind this course is that we're controlling everything in the picture as much as possible in order to create the effects that we want. So let's say then that your focal point then is going to be, what's going to make sense to put there? Let's say your focal point is going to be some old jalopy wandering into town. Who knows what the stranger behind that wheel is going to be up to? Let's say that that's going to be your focal point. This might be drawing number 1. This might be drawing number 2. Drawing number 2 does not need to have a frame around it. Okay, it's just a drawing. But this drawing has to make sense relative to this. So this is an easy way around this, because if I put this object in here directly over top of the focal point, first off, what that does is it uses directional focus now to draw my attention towards that object. It immediately becomes a focal point. It's inside of an open space that I've conveniently provided for it. And now, because you have all of these directional lines as well as central positioning, it immediately becomes obvious what that thing is supposed to be, or what the focal point of the picture is supposed to be. So this then, with this included, that's drawing number 3. Okay, now, ideally, I mean, you've also got like a bit of a landscape and stuff in behind here that helps to contextualize this thing. Because obviously this is just a road off to nowhere that this guy's coming in from the hinterlands on. That's effectively a quick and dirty version of your assignment.
The second drawing, we're drawing also in 1 point perspective, right?
Yes. So let's say that you want to draw your focal point, like you've for whatever reason decided that your focal point is going to be here or here. What I mean by that your horizon line has to match is that you know, roughly speaking, that your focal point is going to be right about there. So if that's the case, then that perspective has to make sense relative to where your focal point is going to be. So if you want to draw a car that's going to be in here, that perspective of that car has to be in the same perspective as the street, relating to the same horizon line. Likewise, like if you've got a UFO that's going to be your focal point, that should relate to the horizon line that you've established. Right, because I mean, you can draw, for example, a car like this. Right, for drawing number 2, but that's not going to fit in here. Right, because if you put that there, that thing's going to be way off in the distance like this. I mean, I suppose it kind of works, right? But it's a little bit weird. Right, but if you put that down here or up here, now you've identified a horizon line like this, and that obviously doesn't work because now you've got multiple horizon lines inside that picture. Okay, how's that sit for everyone?
Question, does this have to be a street scene, or can this be any scene we can pull this off with?
Honestly, it's like it doesn't really matter to me. I think that I've dedicated it to a street scene, but if you want to do this as an interior scene, as long as it meets these requirements, then it's fine. The original version of this assignment was, you know, in coordination with the ellipse assignment. So it was a street scene because then you were designing wheels, right, and dealing with ellipses right inside of that. And this is a bit of a hangover from it, but it doesn't really matter whether or not it's a street scene. So as long as you have these characteristics in it, that's totally fine.
Sure.
If you wanted to make this in a bird's eye view or worm's eye view, like what would you put for the focal point?
Anything that would make sense from that perspective. So for instance, like say that there's your vanishing point, and there's a building. And you just have an unending row of buildings set up that are identical to each other. There's no reason that you couldn't do this. Let's say there's a really thin side off. Maybe your focal point is, you know, it's just a bird that flies in over top of it. That'd be fine. Yeah. It could also just as easily be a car that, you know, pulls into frame and parks there. That is surrounded by, say, other cars at varying angles, right? Because, you know, you've at the end of a street chase, so to speak. Right, so that could be an aerial view of the end of a street or a chase sequence with, you know, bad guy, villain, cop, whatever, right? Positioned over top of that. It's a good point because you could do this in both bird's eye view or worm's eye view as well, because they're both 1 point, so you can put that vanishing point directly in the middle of the frame quite easily.
So in the chase sequence, would all the cars be the focal point or only the middle one?
Only this one, right?
Okay.
Because again, like I said, there's multiple ways of creating focus. We're only dealing with 2 of them,
Mm.
right? So there's at least 3 other ways of creating focus that we're going to go over, right? Off the top of my head, there's probably more.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's take I mean, we've already kind of discussed the examples, so we don't really need to kind of like beat these things over the head, right? But I mean, there is benefit in looking at these things, so, and just compounding that. Okay, so for example, in this scene, there's a really good example of the interior space, the repetition of that 1-point patterning. Right now, it's got a little bit of variety, desperate pleas for individuality, kind of like stuck up all over the place. Right, so it's not a great example, this one, but pretty good. Right? And if you go forward just a little bit, you got not only the 1-point patterning, but you also get the 2-point pattern. Right, where you can use that 1-point grid to create a 2-point grid, and you kind of get the sense of what this environment is meant to communicate. You know, remember this guy from the initial clip. He's got the cool car, right? He's got the cool outfit. He's got the big red shiny button that he gets to push, right? He gets to, again, jump, fly, zip, and zoom anywhere. This environment is soul crushing. He's got a monochromatic environment, no color, fluorescent soul killing lighting. He not only has a shitty little cubicle that's way too small for him, he's got a shitty little cubicle up against a giant cement pillar that makes it even smaller and less comfortable for him. So this is what I mean by an environment being actively engaged in conflicting that character, right? These 2 things are antagonists in a relationship. And when we go forward towards the end, you can see a really good example of your assignment, for instance. This character in the middle of the frame, or along that central axis, 1-point vanishing point somewhere off in the distance behind him, and how that character pops up into this space that is conveniently left open for him. Right, so he doesn't pop up in front of this, he pops up over here. And that empty space in behind that character is going to be important as we move forward in terms of developing focal points. Now, this is in direct opposition to his boss. Right, look at how everything's in perfect control. All the clocks tell the same time. Perfect balance on either side of the scene. When this character moves this pencil back into position, this is my favorite part of the movie. You know everything you need to know about this character, right, in terms of their personality. Right, and that personality, right, is reflected by this perfect balance, right, perfect control, right, perfect artificiality, right, of their environment. Okay, so again, this character thrives in this environment, whereas, right, and look at like the way that they distinguish these characters, how hard the edges are to these characters, how hard the edges are to the teeth of that character, how abrupt and harsh the suit is in terms of their design. As opposed to this character, how soft that character is, right? How comparably approachable that character is. This is a really nice touch as well that I like from this sequence. Look how uncomfortable that chair is. Right? Like it physically leans forward for that character. Okay, so this functions not only on the macro level, it also functions on the micro level, right? In terms of the design of objects and characters as well. Now, the best part about this sequence isn't the ridiculous historical inaccuracies of it, right? Or the outright silliness of most of this film. Right? But what this film does do really, really well is shit like this. they have a constant, the Spartans are constantly talking about how if they move as a single unit, work as a collective, there's no chinks in the armor, so to speak, right? That they're essentially indestructible, right? So what's said multiple times throughout this movie is visually compounded. So when they move, they all move the same, at the same time, in unison, right? As a unit, they're all dressed the same. They've all got the same stuff, right? For all intents and purposes, they are a singularity. Now, that's all nice. That's all really nice, right? But what makes this really visually effective is this, because when you compare this group of people to this group of people over here, and compare their relative organizational qualities, right? Just in terms of design, it's immediately apparent that these groups of people aren't going to get along. Right now, this is to say nothing about the fact that the Persian Empire was the largest, most cultivated, civilized empire on the planet at the time. So you can dispense with like the historical bigotry and inaccuracies that go along with this and privilege the Spartans somehow, right, above the Persians, right? This is just a convenient visual way, right, that deserves to be ridiculed, right, in terms of its political and historical inaccuracies, but makes it visually obvious who's doing what and who's not going to get along with who. And what's the best part about this is that when the fight actually starts, is the choreography also lends itself to this. So when you watch, I got to skip forward past the talking because it's unbearable. When this fighting starts, watch how when the shields go up, they go up in unison and they go up 3 or 4 at a time. Shields go up, spears go forward 3 or 4 at a time, spears come back 3 or 4 at a time, shields go down 3 or 4 at a time, and then everybody steps forward. It's like watching a piston work, right? Which lends it that sense, right? Well, which accentuates that sense of artificiality to this. So this is one of the things that a really bad movie does really, really well, is this constant reaffirmation of the things that they're saying visually. And how effective that is in terms of you identifying, right, with these characters in a particular way. Okay, now we're gonna watch my favorite part of this movie just because it's funny. This part right here.
The 2 people.
Yeah. Leonidas throws the spear so hard that it kills that guy. It's so dumb. Right, but even in this sequence, they have another really nice use of repetition that you can, it's nice to be aware of when you get into your film classes, because they're repeating motion, but repeating motion to compound an effect. Right, so look at what happens in the background when Leonidas hits this last guy. Right, so you get a repetition of action in the background that makes that action in the foreground even more impactful. And then you get a foreshadowing in the background, right, of what's about to happen in the foreground. And so there's lots of different uses of this. This is just, a particularly effective one in an unfortunately bad movie. Right, and this doesn't take very much time to show at all. Because it immediately becomes apparent what I mean by the bad side of things being now associated with repetition. When you see that. Right, so it's entirely arbitrary how you attach these organizational systems to each other, but only arbitrary in the sense of like, what are the characteristics of the group that you're trying to portray, right? Is logic, reason, order, right? Coldness, emotional distance. Are those things being associated with the good side of things? They're being associated with the bad side of things, and vice versa. Because when you get here, and you look at the rebel force, everybody's different. Everybody's unique. Everybody's an individual. Right? So again, you know that these characters aren't going to get along, right, with each other. I mean, you ever wonder why like the X-Wings and like the rebel force, just like when they show up to do battle, it's just like they just show up all over the fucking place. Like there's no organizational system to them whatsoever. Well, it's because the Empire is organized so well. There's just like these classic tactical formations that make it look really sexy, right? In terms of an organizational structure as opposed to just chaos. Okay, that are all the words that I need to say for today, officially. Next week is essentially going to be the exact same assignment, but with a focus on different things. So, and by the exact same assignment, I mean it's going to be the same sort of one drawing in 3 parts, but we're going to be focusing on different aspects of how to put that drawing together.
Will that one also be in 1 point, or will that one be in 2 point?
That'll be in 2 point.
Ah, okay.
You see the method to my madness as I twirl my mustache. All right. Do you guys have any questions about what we've gone over today or your assignment that does not include questions about your last assignment, which I will field, or other assignments that I will field individually? Next week is your last class, which means that your assignment from that class, unfortunately, you get an assignment over the term break, which you don't really get one. So it'll be due at the first class of the second term. All of your redos, right, are due next class, right? So you've already got a kind of like a preamble warning that, you know, this was kind of coming up, right? But if you're going down the redo route, you've got until next Monday, right, at 1 p.m. to hand those redos in, right? And again, just email them to me. So you can redo this assignment that I'm giving you today. You can redo this one until the first class of next term, right? And then that last assignment that you'll get, all right, next week, you can redo that until the first week of the end of the first week of the first term, or of the second term. Okay, but at that point, there's not going to be an opportunity because I have to have submit your grades by a certain date, blah, 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 boring administrative stuff. Okay, so for those of you who don't have questions individually about your assignment, you're free to go. For those of you who do have questions individually, I'm just going to go grab a glass of water, stretch my legs, and then I will be back and I will field the questions to your heart's content.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I will be back momentarily. Call momentarily like 5 minutes, so I'll be back at 2:30.
Okay. Thanks for class.
Thanks
My
for
pleasure.
class.
Thank you.
Thank
bet.
you.
Yo. What is up? Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Okay.
You just because I emailed you the 3 and 4 that I was fixing up.
Mhm.
Said continuing to work on this after we talk about it again next class. So can we just go over it again?
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, that's okay. I remember looking at it earlier today, and